Well, today is Celebration Sunday here at St. John's. Now, until this year, this day was known as Welcoming Sunday, but we noticed that a huge amount of people kept saying it was Welcome Back Sunday because I guess so many people take the summer off of church, but we didn't really want to make, taking the summer off a thing, and so we didn't want Welcome Back Sunday. And so Welcoming Sunday, which was never Welcome Back Sunday, got changed to Celebration Sunday. So all makes sense, I hope. Now, I started here at St. John's just about 3 years ago, and so one of my very first Sundays was a Welcoming Sunday. And I was told in the build-up to that over and over and over again just how great and grand and amazing Welcoming Sunday is in the life of St. John's. It's a really big deal, Eric. I was told and then retold, and then I was told that again in case I somehow missed it. It's a really big deal. And I'd learned already in that really short time to trust people at St. John's if they say something's a really big deal. Although I must admit that 3 years later, I have yet to have anyone from St. John's ever say to me, now, Eric, this is a really little deal here at St. John's, but I think that's just because we don't trade in that sort of currency around here. All that to say that today is this big, exciting day as we're kicking off a new program year with lots of new and exciting opportunities to get involved and get together, and thus we have every reason to celebrate this place that God has given us to call our church home. So welcome to Celebration Sunday. Now, I tend to be the type of preacher who likes to look ahead at what I'm going to be preaching on. And particularly knowing this was going to be kind of a big deal Sunday, I eagerly anticipated what words of welcome, not welcome back, but welcome that Jesus would have for us in today's gospel lesson to be paired with our celebration and welcome to the world. And yet I was taken aback to see what Jesus wants to talk about today, and that it's church fights. I don't know if you were listening to the gospel, but that's what he is talking about, church fights and how they can get to be so bad that ultimately you just have to have someone leave the church. And not just leave, he says, but then to be treated as about as popular as an auditor for the IRS, a tax collector, as he puts it, or treat them like a Gentile, which is disquieting to hear, as a Gentile. But that's what he's giving us today, so welcome. Now, to be fair, these things actually do have to be talked about in community, because unfortunately, these things happen in every community, even church communities. And do you know why they happen in church communities? It's because they let folks like us in here. That's really the problem, if you don't know it. They let folks like us in here, and if they just stopped that, the place would be perfect. But no, it's filled with us. You can just look around and see here we are. And thus, even today, Jesus wants to talk about our not totally perfect ways, even though we would love to just bury that in the small print, particularly on a big deal Sunday. Of course, what Jesus is saying here is just undeniably the truth. People don't always act right, even in church, which is kind of a duh sort of thing for most of us to hear because people don't act perfectly right anywhere. But somehow this still comes as a really big surprise to some people. The uncle you have or whatever who says, I'd never go to church. It's just filled with hypocrites who don't totally live into their ideals, to which I'd really just love to answer to that person, well, why don't you come and join us, and then we'll have one more. Because, see, that's everybody. That's just people. That's all of us. And so if we're actually going to send out a welcome to real people, that means they might actually show up here. And when they do, they will, like all of us, struggle with the issues that exist anywhere that real people show up, which is everywhere, which makes it so surprising how so surprising this really is. I have to tell you, I've spent my entire life very much in the center of the life of the church, and I love the church. I couldn't imagine I wouldn't be me without the influence on the church throughout my life. And yet given all that exposure and obviously now working within a church community, I would be the first to admit that being in a church is to be cast into a great irony. I mean, on the one hand, the church is of God. It's very much a creation of Christ. And yet, on the other hand, the church is also very much of humanity. It's filled with ordinary men and women trying their best to live together in community, which is hard in this world and is a discipline desperately needed within our culture because it's one that's being lost, is how to be in community. And yet, that's what we're doing. And the community is always touched by all of our humanity. It bears all of the weaknesses and the flaws of our humanity. And so on the one hand, Paul rightly calls the church the body of Christ, which is lofty and correct. The church uniquely has a share in eternity because we are one with Jesus. And yet, the church as a body looks a lot like our bodies. That is, it carries the same flaws and warps and blemishes and flab and imperfections and wounds as any body that we would ever look at in a mirror. And Jesus, knowing all of this, today calls us to just be honest about it, about who we really are. And the good news is he gives us the grace to, for once, own up to it, to our less than perfect ways, and the chance to better perfect ourselves by owning up to all of that. And really the only thing that can disqualify us from participating in his communal life, where you become the tax collector and the Gentile like, is not our many imperfections. That's not the problem. It's only when we stubbornly insist that we don't have them, that we're always right, that there's no room for reform in me. Every time that I do wedding counseling with a couple about to get married, I talk to them about the need for them to be able to own up to not being right all the time. That if they don't know how to say they're sorry, they need to learn it. It's one reason we do confession every week in here, because that part of ourselves that we just want to bury and act like it isn't real, it's devastating when it's hidden, it's devastating when it's not owned up to, and it's freeing and transformative when it is. And so Jesus tells us the truth of our lives in order that that truth doesn't have to own us or have to destroy everything in its path. And again, this is the unique call of church, to be a community filled with real people who are owning up to the messes in their lives and celebrating, even as they celebrate the good things, in order that we might be more. And God knows the world needs those sorts of communities. And yet, I still kind of wish that Jesus had picked another day to talk about all this, because it's just kind of practical and everyday advice. And it's a big deal day. And yet, maybe your life is kind of screaming at you right now that you need to not only attend to the big deal stuff that seems to overwhelm everything else, but maybe start paying attention to the little deals that actually make up most of life. Maybe you, like me, are ready for something a little less exciting to happen in this world, so that you can more attend to the simple and the practical and the mundane things that are so easily swamped by all the big deal stuff. And maybe that's why this simple, ordinary lesson is so vital for our lives. Because where the life of faith ultimately has to be lived out, if it's going to be lived out outside of these walls, is in the earthy, feet-on-the-ground stories that make up most of life. I was raised in a Christian tradition that placed a very high value on spiritual adrenaline. Mountaintop experiences were very much valued, even if they were too often manufactured. The favored faith was always exhibited, and exhibited is the right word for it, in flashy and dramatic ways. And yet it's like my dad said when I told him as a kid that I wanted to live in Hawaii. You can't live your life on vacation, son. Life becomes life no matter where you live. And so it is with our faith. Our faith must be lived out here, in the normal neighborhoods where our lives are also lived out. And the good news of Jesus is that our God cares about those normal neighborhoods where our lives are lived. He doesn't expect us to just live our lives only in holy places or on mountaintop experiences, those extraordinary moments that come our way every now and again and are true gifts when they arrive, but they aren't the everyday addresses where we make our homes. Thankfully, that's not how our God works. To the contrary, he insists in the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, in God's coming into this world, that this world matters. And therefore, the small stuff of your life and my life matters as well. A few years ago, there was a struggle in our house over what to watch on TV. Now, this is not unusual in and of itself, but what this was about on this particular night, the issue was that on one channel, the Nobel Prize-winning laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel was to be interviewed, but that was set to come on the exact same time as American Idol. And we had some family, and they were visiting from out of town, and they were really into American Idol. God bless their hearts. And what struck me was that both of these presentations fall within that category known as reality TV. And yet, look at these two realities. One reality is actually pretty unreal. It's glossy and fake and packaged. Yet the other one is unflinchingly real. Well, needless to say, everybody scattered to other TVs when I turned on my choice, Elie Wiesel. Of course, people do that in the face of that sort of reality. Who wants to look at and have to deal with that? And yet I'm very glad I did decide to deal with that night, because I'll never forget Wiesel talking about this image that continued to haunt him from his youth. It's the image of this great mountain of shoes. Just ordinary shoes, but shoes piled unbelievably high just outside of the crematorium in the concentration camp where he was in prison. Kids' shoes, baby shoes, mommy and daddy shoes, grandparent shoes, all kinds of everyday shoes that once walked through all kinds of everyday lives. And as I, in my mind, pictured that ghastly pile of those simple everyday items so cavalierly tossed aside with those lives, everything within me all of a sudden said, God must care even about those shoes, or I could not care about a God who does not. And that's why today's lesson from Jesus in its simplicity is to me a promise, as much as some little instruction manual about playing nicely with others. It's the promise that when Jesus did the big things around here, he never neglected the small things while doing them. He never neglected the small places in which we live or the small people like us who inhabit those small places. He didn't just attend to the big deal things around here, but to the everyday little things. He's that big of a God that he can care for the big and the small and everything in between, the whole of everything, and therefore us in it. Which really is, when you think about it, a big deal for a Big Deal Sunday. And really quite the welcome into his big deal life. So, welcome and celebrate. Amen.